Brian, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on Shifting Culture. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be with you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I'd love to start where you started with the book, in the Camino de Santiago, on
hmm
pilgrimage, meditating on crucifixes, the cross of Christ at different churches on that journey. Can you just take us to where you were on that journey and
Yeah,
what was going through your mind?
this was we've walked the Camino de Santiago 4 times now, but this was the first one. And it began on September 16th, 2016, which is Holy Cross Day. It wasn't planned that way. And I think I wasn't even I don't think I was aware of it that day. But the first stage on the Camino de Santiago Francés is a hard stage. You start in Saint Jean Pied de Port, France, and cross the Pyrenees. It's like a 15-mile day, and you're crossing mountains. It's hard work.
Wow.
And we got into Roncesvalles, staying in this monastery. And I went into their chapel because there was some time between when we got there and got settled in, and then we were waiting for dinner. And I went in their chapel, and I was just sitting in there. I don't know if I was even praying. I was just, I think, just sitting. I was looking at a crucifix in the chapel. And, Joshua, I don't use this kind of language too often where I say, I feel like God said something. I'm not that guy that God told me, God told me, God told me. But there are moments, right? I mean, this is the living God.
Yeah.
and I felt like, I'll say it this way, I felt like the Holy Spirit gave me some direction for this, what would turn out to be a 40-day, 500-mile walk. And it was like this: enter every church you can, find the crucifix, pay attention to it, ask this question: what does this mean? And don't be too quick to give an answer. And so I thought, okay, I'll do that. Now, you are passing church because, churches grew up, all along because it was such an important pilgrim route. So there's lots of churches. I mean, some of them are active, some of them aren't, some of them are in ruins, some of them are still thriving. But Perry and I, we tried to go in, and we went in every church that was open. Not all of them were, but the ones that did, and sometimes I would just look at the cross because maybe we're still trying to complete our stage that day. So I might just be in there for a few moments. Others, staying a little longer. And then often when we'd arrive at the next village where we were staying, I'd go find a church and I'd stay in there for an hour or more. And here's the thing. Well, a couple of things. One, I grew up Protestant. I describe myself as I'm Protestant by default, but I'm not really protesting anything. And so, but that means I grew up around abstract crosses, but not much around crucifixes because those don't show up much in Protestant churches. Now, by this time I'd been around a lot of Catholic churches, but now I was seeing crucifixes multiple times every day and trying to pay attention to them. And because we're on the move, I'm not seeing the same one every day. I'm seeing a different one many times a day. And that was the seed bed for me. I mean, of course, I've been thinking about the cross. I'd already been writing about the cross, but this experience back in 2016, I mean, you could describe it as 500 miles of crucifixes or a 40-day walking meditation on the cross. And so that's what lurks in the background of this book.
So as you were paying attention, what are some of the things that popped up for you?
Well, I mean, for one thing, you see, I think probably nearly every, I mean, I don't know, but I think almost every crucifix I saw was an original. So these weren't mass produced. And so there are all kinds of different ones. Sometimes you would see a regal Christ with not a crown of thorns, but a royal crown, and almost not so much on the cross as in front of the cross. and wearing a robe. This is the earliest Byzantine style. So you'd see that. And that communicates, the cross is in fact his throne. But then you would see others that were filled with pathos, and some that really accentuated the suffering. Some are, in my opinion, artistically are better done than others. But then there is this aspect of, if you just pause for a moment and think about it, isn't this the most depicted image in the history of world art? Has anything been a specific scene, has anything been depicted more than the crucifixion of Jesus Christ? And we can become sort of, crucifix, I've seen a million of them. But wait, hold on. Isn't this, no matter what you believe, religiously, theologically, isn't this just interesting anthropologically?
Mm-hmm.
That in human culture, the most depicted image is that of a naked man nailed to a tree.
Hmm.
That's got to mean something. Now, what it means, well, that's now we're off to the races. But
Yeah.
I think it once again should scandalize us. It should shock us.
Yeah. The cross is very shocking. Can be grotesque. It is, full of suffering, difficult anguish. How in the world can a God come incarnate with us and
Yeah.
die in a way like this?
Yeah.
Working with Muslims for many years, they love Jesus. They're like, his teachings are great, but he didn't die on the cross. Like, there's no
No,
way. It's so shameful. There's no way he could have done it. He would have been
that's the scandal of the
pushed out.
cross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why? How does it reveal the nature and the character of God, the scandalous cross?
Well, there's so much to be said here, and it's such a vast. I don't know where to start.
Mm.
I'll say this: one of the most potent challenges to the validity of Christian faith is the problem of pain, the problem of suffering,
Mm.
the problem that innocent people suffer greatly. And so the question is, how can a good, wise, powerful God, a loving God, allow such gratuitous suffering, especially of innocent people? The attempt to answer that question is what we call theodicy. And, I think you eventually have to evoke some aspects of free will in certain things. But I think if we have anything like a theodicy in the Christian faith, one aspect of it is this: that in the cross we see that for whatever reason there is suffering in the world, God in Christ has not exempted himself from it, but he shares it fully with us. No one can accuse God of saying, you allow innocent people to suffer, but you stand aloof. No, he was nailed to a cross. He was crucified. He is the crucified God, to use the language of Ergon Moltmann. And so here's the whole point of my book. I essentially give 19 chapters and a poem, kind of a long poem at the end, about different ways I use. It's like looking at the cross through a kaleidoscope. It's a kaleidoscopic meditation upon the cross, where how a kaleidoscope works. With each turn, you get different images, different geometric designs, different colors. And so one of the things I'm really pushing back, and I think one of the worst things we've done
Mm.
is try to reduce the cross to one meaning. Oh, the cross means this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next question, please. And no. And so I'm making my contribution. Here's 19 things that I see the cross saying, 20 if you count this last one, the poem. So we can't ever quite be done with the cross, and I don't think we should. And so I can't remember what the original question was now, Josh. What do you like?
Well, as you're looking through the kaleidoscope, and you're seeing the different facets and aspects of the cross.
Mhm.
When you were starting to pay attention to those different aspects, was walking through this book for you, you've done a lot of different work with, God is a loving God. We have,
Mhm.
nonviolence and,
Correct.
the subversive power of what the cross is. But was there anything surprising to you that you came up with, like, "Oh, that was a new take for me?"
Yeah, I I have a chapter on Mary at the
Mm.
cross, which surprised even me. I I didn't plan when I first outlined the book, I didn't have that chapter as a idea. And then I actually had a dream where I was writing that chapter. I mean, I dreamt that I was writing a chapter on Mary at the foot of the cross.
Mhm,
Now, I mean, part of this I'm sure is influenced by the fact that I've spent so much time in Spain and Portugal. We were just there. I spent the whole month of October this past year in Spain and Portugal, so we
mm,
go there a lot. And we're pilgrims these days, Perry and I. We like these long pilgrim walks, and so you see a lot of this kind of image in these places. So that was surprising to me that I had that in there. But also, and we were talking before we started recording that the book itself, which I actually don't have a copy of yet, but I hope to have one like soon, have the advanced reader copy like you have.
yeah,
But the actual hardback edition has 16 photos in it, or what they are is they're images of artwork. About half of them are my own, like, pictures I've
mm,
taken of crucifixes, and the others are maybe public domain that I could get. There's one that I had to get permission. Ivanka Demchuk, she's a Ukrainian iconographer in Lviv, and
mm,
she graciously granted me permission to use one of her icons. But so I would say part of what's different here is I'm working pretty strong with image,
mhm,
not just with the text of the Bible and abstract theological thought, but I'm really wanting to employ image.
mm,
I want you to, that language of Paul where he says, before whose eyes Christ was publicly portrayed
mm,
as crucified. I'm inviting people to look. I mean, as we're recording this, I have this is a Russian Orthodox
mm,
uh, cross icon that I got in Bethlehem many years ago. And I'm at my writing desk. Yes, I also Zoom from here, but this is my writing desk. And every book I've written has been written with this cross icon because I want
mm,
the cross to preside over my writing.
mm,
And so I'm always looking at it. And so I would say that was surprising how much I leaned into actually image.
hmm. So what does image do? What does art and beauty do for us to draw us into
Right.
what the cross is and the cross means?
Well, see, here's the thing. Like if you look at this, I mean, I I would expect most people, if they look at this very long, they go, "Oh, that's beautiful." That word will come up, beautiful,
Mhm,
and it is. Yeah, it is beautiful. But it's an image of a man being tortured to death. So
mhm,
just pause here. I mean, whether it's in churches, cathedrals, the great art museums of the world. I mean, there isn't a great art museum in the Western world that doesn't have many paintings and depictions of Christ crucified, and they're there as as works of art that contain a kind of beauty. And you say, well, what's going on here? And there was a time, you know, when I was much younger, when I sort of rebelled against that, and I viewed it as inappropriate
mhm,
that Christ was depicted as crucified in beautiful terms. But then that was me in my naivete of youth. As I got a little older, a little wiser, I understood that we must not confuse the role of the journalist and the role of the artist.
Hmm.
So the journalist just gives us the facts. Here's the facts. If we had a journalistic photograph of the events of Good Friday at Golgotha,
Hmm.
we might look at it once, regret that we had, and never look at it again. Because
Hmm.
you would see nothing but that which is grotesque, repulsive, ugly. I mean, when the Romans crucified people, they weren't trying to create art.
Hmm.
They were trying to psychologically terrorize a subjected people.
Hmm.
They were giving a warning. This is what happens if you resist Rome. So that artists eventually began to depict Christ crucified in terms of beauty. Is that a mistake? No. Because there's more going on at the cross than just the crucifixion of a Galilean Jew.
Hmm.
And that's at the very heart of the Christian faith.
Hmm.
That this is the love of God on the display. This is the moment where the sin of the world coalesces into a hideous singularity and with great violence is sinned into the body of Jesus, but is forgiven in mass. So I like the analogy of, think of Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. I think most people know what that painting looks like with its swirls of stars. Now, is that what a starry night factually looks like? No. I mean, it's not a one-to-one factual literal depiction of what you see when you look at the sky on a starry night. But what Van Gogh is doing, see, the role of the artist isn't just to give us the fact. The role of the artist is to wake us up and help
Hmm.
us to see what we have overlooked. I think part of what Van Gogh is doing, he's saying what he depicts on his canvas is what we should be experiencing here when we look at the grandeur of a starry night.
Hmm.
And so Van Gogh is saying, wake up or you're going to miss it. Pay attention. And I think that artists depicting the crucifixion of Christ in terms of beauty are doing something very similar.
Hmm.
It was Augustine who said, we have the fact, let us now seek the mystery.
Hmm.
And so, yes, we know that Jesus of Nazareth was put to death by Roman crucifixion under Pontius Pilate.
Hmm.
Well, that's the fact. Let us seek the mystery.
Hmm.
Let us seek what's going on that's much deeper than just the bare, brutal fact of the matter.
Hmm.
And there is beauty there. There is
Yeah.
beauty there.
There's beauty in the mystery, and we need to embrace that as well. The chapter you wrote when you talk about the cross and the lynching tree, that
Mm-hmm.
great book, and then you reference Billie Holiday's song "Strange Fruit"
Mm-hmm.
as she's singing about a man lynched hanging
Yeah.
on a tree. How does the cross of Jesus impact the way that we reckon with the horrors and the incredibly horrible things that have happened in the history
Yeah.
of America?
That's chapter, I'm looking at my book here. That's chapter 13, the lynching of the Son of Man. That's one of the more provocative chapters, no doubt. And clearly, I'm drawing, from James Cone. I mean, I make that
Mhm.
clear throughout the book. I just know there's a lot of people that probably will read my stuff that are never going to read James Cone. So
Mhm.
now
Yeah.
they're going to have to read some James Cone because I'm going to bring it to them. And well, it's the fact that throughout history there have been untold, kind of untold meaning in two ways, untold victims of mob violence or lynching or unjust murders, extrajuridical executions, you might say, and things like that. And Christ dies in solidarity with them. Christ is also one of them. And that there is a kind of parallel between Black victims of lynching in Southern America, especially in the, maybe, let's say, the first half of the 20th century, and how Jesus Christ was also nailed to a tree. That this is the ultimate injustice. I mean, Christ is the sinless one, and yet there is the phenomenon of a mob shouting for his death. That's we should see those sorts of things too. See, this is the problem. I'm just going to come out and say it.
Yeah.
I'm going to come out and say it.
Do
This
it.
is one of the problems with penal substitutionary atonement theory.
Mm,
Now, if you read my book, you'll see that I think that's a flawed theory, as the entire Eastern Orthodox Church has for 2,000 years.
yeah.
And I summon N.T. Wright to my assistance in this. And I think the first or second chapter. But let's set that aside for a second. Even if penal substitutionary atonement theory, it's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Even if it were, and I do not think it is an accurate description of what's happening at the cross, it's problematic in that it has this tendency to obliterate any other meaning.
Hmm.
And so people will say, oh, no, that's where God was pouring out his wrath upon his son so that he could forgive us. I don't think that's what's happening. But even if that's the case, then that's where people say, yeah, I don't need to think about the cross anymore. It's a way of keeping the cross from disturbing them in ways that they probably should be disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to keep it just locked away in the nice, sterile world of theology, rather than, oh, could it speak to racism? Could it speak to practices of capital punishment?
Mm-hmm.
I have a chapter on that too. I mean, if capital punishment can go so bad that it leads to the greatest sin possible, the murder of God, deicide, maybe we ought to rethink that practice. I mean, because it can go wrong.
and it did. But that has gone right for us. But
Right, of course. This is all the mystery. Yes.
it is such a mystery to dive into that. But if we're sitting, how do we take the power of the mystery of the cross and this subversion of power, and not grab a hold of power ourselves and throw it on other people to do what we have done to Christ, when Christ says, I want to do the opposite for you?
Yeah. Well, I think we should stop doing that. Well, one of the things that the cross does in such a powerful way is bring a critique of the principalities and powers.
Mm-hmm.
There's that interesting text in the book of Colossians where Paul is talking about the cross, and he says that the cross put the principalities and powers to shame, that it stripped them and put them to shame.
Hmm.
Now, this is interesting. One of the things we know is that crucified victims were crucified naked. This is part of the insult. This is the nature. I mean, crucifixion is not the point of crucifixion is not just to execute a human being. There's a lot more efficient ways to execute someone. The problem is, the point of crucifixion from the Roman Empire point of view is to terrorize the populace.
Mm-hmm.
And part of crucifixion was the shame of it. In fact, the very word crucifixion, while it was practiced, was a word that people avoided, and they looked for euphemisms because it was so horror-inducing. And part of the horror is the shame of being crucified naked, to the extent that we basically can't bear that even now.
Mm-hmm.
So Christ is, except maybe in some really deliberately provocative modern art, virtually never depicted as actually entirely naked, because that's just too much to bear. But what Paul says is no, it was not Christ who was put to shame. It was the principalities and powers who were behind the crucifixion. So you have You have King Herod, you have Pontius Pilate, you have Joseph Caiaphas,
mm,
and his, wealth and political power and religious authority. And they pretend that we have the right to rule because we are wise and just.
mm,
And the cross strips that pretense away from them and parades them naked through the streets and says, "You
mm,
are neither wise nor just. You're
mm,
merely ambitious for power."
mm,
And the cross turns that on them.
mm,
And so all forms of violent power, power to dominate, are
mhm,
called into question through the cross. If we can simply stand to, if we can bear to stand in the light of the cross and allow that kind of truth
mm.
to emanate from the cross as it challenges power. I talk about that in several chapters, including the chapters. One of my favorite to write was the chapter entitled "One Ring to Rule Them All." You can tell
Yeah.
where I'm drawing that from.
Yeah,
But
I was excited. We need to talk about Lord of the Rings. That's great.
yeah,
So,
the cross is it is, in one sense, it is the crack of Mount Doom,
mm,
where the ring of power, that is power to dominate others, is destroyed.
mm. So what does it look like for us then to interact with the powers and principalities that have been put to shame in the cross? How do we get the light of cross, the truth of the cross and Jesus into us so that we can engage powers and principalities in the world and have them put to shame while we interact with other people?
Well, we're going to have to stop. When we say we, I assume you mean those of us who confess Christ, the baptized,
Yes.
the church.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to stop. Well, I'll continue with this metaphor a little bit longer, pursuing the ring of power. And because if we do that, I mean, Tolkien is writing a Christian story.
Mhm.
And he says that in private correspondence. I'm writing a Christian story here. He's not like Lewis. It isn't a direct allegory. He doesn't do that. But it is a Christian story. And part of the Christian story is how corrupting worldly power is, and how God himself eschews that power. And God comes among us not as we would expect, as a mighty regal and riding a war horse and that sort of thing, but he comes among us and joins us in our vulnerability and
Mm,
actually overthrows the kingdom of darkness through death, not through killing. And then in Tolkien's story, the recurring theme is no one can bear the ring very long without being corrupted by it. And in
mhm,
fact, the most powerful people won't even touch it if they're wise. Gandalf won't even touch it. Aragorn won't touch it. Galadriel won't touch it. The only ones that can bear it are the more humble, the hobbits.
mhm,
And even then, Frodo couldn't willingly relinquish it. The only person that ever really gives it up willingly is Samwise Gamgee, he's the gardener. He's
mm,
the humblest of the humble, and he was able to relinquish it. Well, that's speaking to us about the nature of power. And as long as the
mm,
church is fascinated by political power,
mhm,
and we reach for the sword of Caesar rather than what Christ calls us to take up the cross, which again is one of those phrases that is not as shocking as it should be to us,
mhm,
because we've heard it for so long and we've got 2,000 years of history, and we immediately just think of that in terms of religion. You understand what that when Jesus first said, "If anyone wants to become my disciple, let him take up his cross," that would be, I don't know how you ever build a movement around that.
I don't
Take
think you
take up
can.
your electric chair, take up
Yeah.
your gallows, take up your lethal injection table and follow me,
Mm,
because most likely we're going to be marching to our own death.
mm,
Woo! But
yeah.
but that's the kind of presence we're called to enact in the world. Now, look, I know
Mm,
the vast majority of the baptized are not going to be called upon to become martyrs, literally. And yet it's always on the table. And one of the things I
Mhm.
find so shocking is that in American Christianity, martyrdom is almost looked upon as shameful.
Mhm.
Whereas the early church, you know, you had pastors in the early church. This is the pre-Constantine church that occasionally had to say, "Now, don't just go out and look for an excuse to get martyred.
Yeah.
You shouldn't do that because the martyrs were held in such esteem." But that kind of thinking is almost entirely absent in this Christianity that is present in the current superpower because
Mhm.
we're too enamored by Babylonian style power.
Mm. Well, I
And
wanna
the cross is where all of that is undone.
yes.
If we can sit with the cross long enough, opening our soul to it, being honest, that the cross itself will eventually begin to undo all of that kind of thinking,
Mm.
that
I
imperial
yeah.
thinking.
I hope it does. I hope it undoes it sooner rather than later, as soon as possible.
Amen. I'm with you,
We need
brother.
we need to get it done. So then how I wanna jump back a little bit to Samwise Gamgee and say, how does he resist then the power of the ring? This humble gardener, how does he resist it?
You know what? It's so beautiful. Hold on here. Just give me a moment, please.
Yeah, love to.
One ring to rule them all, page 97. So if those of you that kind of are familiar, you'll remember that when Frodo nearly perishes with his encounter with Shelob, that Sam ends up with the ring. And there was a brief moment where he was tempted. And he kind of had a fleeting vision of him becoming, what is it, Samwise the Strong. And he kind
Mm,
of, so the ring tried to work on him, but here's how he was able to resist. And this is from Lord of the Rings. In that hour of trial, it was the love of his master that helped him most to hold firm. But also deep down in him lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm, his own hands to use, not the hands of others to command.
mm,
So if now to take it from the Lord of the Rings and then bring it to the church, I would say that it would behoove us to be much more modest in our aspirations. And I think it would serve us well to just set aside all of this change the world rhetoric. We're going to change the world. Let's change the world. Let's be world changers. Let's change the world. Because when we talk like that, eventually the ring of power becomes too seductive.
mm,
And by ring of power, I mean the sword of Caesar. I mean the power of political coercion, where we can pass the right laws and we can get enough elephants or donkeys,
yeah.
into the Congress and we'll change. No, our task is not to change the world. It's
Mm,
Jesus who's the savior of the world, not us.
mhm,
Our task is not to change the world. Our task is to simply be that part of the world already changed by Christ. Now, if somebody says, well, that's how you change the world, I'll say, shh, because you can't think about that too directly.
mhm,
You sort of just, okay, maybe,
mm,
maybe.
mm,
But it's not our job to change because, you know, I'm bouncing back and forth between
mhm,
political theology and Lord of the Rings, but as one should. Gandalf explains, he says, look, I could take the ring and the ring would first come to me out of a desire to do good.
mm,
But in the end, it would corrupt me. And we could say, okay, we need power to change the world. And we could say, and here's all the good things we want to accomplish. We'll build a Christian nation through the apparatus of political power. And we'll do all this good, but in the end, it will corrupt us every time.
Mm,
Because Christ reigns from the cross, not from an imperial throne in Rome or Washington.
mm,
So I just think if we could just humble ourselves and say, and it would take a lot of pressure off us. It's not our job to change the world.
mm, mhm,
If the world's going to be changed and saved, that's up to Christ. It's enough. This is a modest aspiration, and it's enough to simply be this little part of the world already changed by Christ.
mm.
I really believe that.
Well, it reminds me that the kingdom of God can be unveiled. Like it is here. We can live in the under the reign and rule of Christ,
Yeah.
and that will be unveiled as we go on living under the reign and rule of Christ. As that brings us back into right before Jesus was put to death on the cross, when he's talking to Pontius Pilate and talking about a kingdom. I am a king, but not of this world. It's not a kingdom that you think
Exactly.
of. What is this kingdom of God? How is it different? What is the truth of it? And how can we share the truth of it in the world?
Well, that whole scene that you sort of allude to, that's a beautiful scene. And in that chapter where I talk, is a chapter called "What Is Truth?" When I talk about Pilate, I bring up the point that Pilate is a pretty fascinating character. In that here is a human being that presides over the trial of God. And this has captured the imagination of all kinds of writers. Mikhail Bulgakov, I make reference to him and his work, Master and Margarita, but I really work from Frederick Buechner,
Mhm.
who his depiction of Pilate is just filled with these comical anachronisms. And so Pilate, it's supposed to be the first century, but he's on the telephone, and his wife is seeing an analyst right now, and he likes his evening martinis, and he's smoking a cigarette. And at one point, he takes a long drag on a cigarette. What is truth? but here's the thing. So when Jesus is brought before the Roman governor, Pilate doesn't care anything about obscure theological questions. He understands that that's part of what's going on with why the Sanhedrin has brought him here, but he didn't care about that. All he cares about, he's a practical, pragmatic politician. He's tasked with keeping order in the Roman province of Judea. And so he cuts to the chase. Are you a king? Because if Jesus claims to be a king, well, then that's going to be viewed, as some form of treason, because the Roman Empire only recognizes Caesar, and Herod is king because Caesar says so. If you have some guy just willy-nilly saying I'm a king, well, then he's a rebel and needs to be crucified. So Pilate says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "You say I'm a king." And then he says, "My kingdom is not from this world." Pause. This is true. Christ's kingdom is for this world, but it's not from this world. It doesn't come, what do we mean by the world? We mean the whole thing that was set in motion all the way back. When Cain kills Abel, moves east to Eden, and founds the first city. So these are the kingdoms that are founded upon denying that our brother is really our brother. We call them other enemy and slay them and build our cities upon their corpses. And this is Egypt, this is Babylon, this is Greece, this is Persia, this is Rome. And Jesus says to Pilate, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting." He said, "Yes." Jesus is tacitly saying, "Yeah, I'm a king, but it's not I'm a king of a kingdom you can't understand."
Hmm.
because it just doesn't come the way that you think of kingdoms coming. It is a kingdom. And then of course, what he says, and Jesus says to Pilate, for this purpose I came into the world to bear witness to the truth.
Hmm.
And everyone who's of the truth listens to what I have to say. And that's when Pilate famously says, what is truth? Then there's a break, and Jesus is taken away and scourged. He's brought back, and Pilate resumes his interrogation. But now Jesus just doesn't respond to him because he doesn't have anything more to say to him. And Pilate, in frustration, says, don't you know? Don't you understand? Don't you understand that I have power to release you and I have power to kill you? Well, that right there is Pilate answering his own question. What is truth? For Pilate, this is the central truth human civilization, that the world is run by people who have the greatest capacity to kill. So for Pilate, the world is organized around an axis of power enforced by violence. And Jesus comes into the world and says that truth is a lie. That's not the truth at all. So in part, because I completely resist saying the cross is this and that's it. No, one of the things that happens at the cross is the world is in fact refounded. Instead of being organized around an axis of power enforced by violence, inaugurated by Cain, and it's carried all the way through up until the present moment in the gospel story, is when Tiberius Caesar's ruling the world, and Pontius Pilate is an extension of that. Christ refounds the world around an axis of love expressed in forgiveness. So the church has to decide, do we want to be organized around an axis of power enforced by violence? As we pursue political power, that's what we're actually agreeing with Pilate. Or worse yet, I can take it a little further, because Pilate's just a pagan Roman governor. You have Caiaphas, who is the high priest and should know better. He should know better. And there's that blood-chilling moment when, because Pilate doesn't like Caiaphas. He doesn't like him at all. He doesn't like being in Judea. He doesn't like any of this assignment, but he's got to do it. And at this point, he probably already knows that he's going to have to sign off on crucifying this prophet from Galilee. But he's egging on Caiaphas. Oh, you want me to crucify your king? He knows good and well that that Caiaphas doesn't believe that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. But he's egging him on. And he says, "Oh, you want me to crucify your king? Do you? You sure? He's your king, you know. You want me to crucify your king? Because they have animosity." And that's when Caiaphas. This is just shocking. There's this moment where he takes off the mask and he says, "We have no king but Caesar." It's like saying this: look, you're a Roman governor, I'm a high priest, but we all know the truth that the real power is in Rome with Caesar. This is how I gain proximity to it. This is how I play the game. This is the mask I wear. But let's just be clear, we're both on the same page. We know how it works. And we have no king but Caesar. When the church convinces itself that it must have political power to establish the will of God and the kingdom of God and the reign of God on earth, the church is essentially saying, we have no king but Caesar. We don't really believe there's power in the cross. We don't really believe there's power in resurrection. What we believe is that there's power in the sword. There's power in coercive government. There's power in imperial might. It's the real power is the legions of Rome or the military of the United States. See, you got me all worked up here, Joshua.
You should be worked up. We do not need to revolve around the axis of power like that. We need to revolve around the axis of love as we see forgiveness in this world. Once we do that, there is as you said, the powers and principalities are put to shame, and that the power is put to shame in the cross of Jesus. If you can, what's one hope that you have for your readers as they're engaging in the poetic mystery of the cross?
Well, I suppose the one hope, if I had one hope, it was is that they would begin to view the cross and say, it's not one thing. There are so many ways that the cross saves, that the cross reveals, that the cross shames, that the cross becomes the primary interpretive lens for all of Scripture and for just actually all of life. It's where we discover who God really is. That being disguised under the disfigurement of an ugly crucifixion and death, Christ crucified is paradoxically the clearest revelation of who God is. I think that's what I would want.
Yeah, you almost made me cry. Like it is. I mean, it should. You should be brought to tears.
Yeah.
That this is who God is. It is the most unreal, unbelievable, incredible thing that God would suffer and die and identify with the suffering of the world
Mm-hmm.
as in Jesus. It's incredible. A couple of questions here. The end one, I would say, last time you were on, I asked you for something, you've been reading or watching that you could recommend. I want to go into something you've been listening. Talk about some music. Anything, any music that you could recommend for us.
Well, I'm a big Dylan fan, and which is kind of like an understatement. That's like one of my real bodies of knowledge.
Mm,
And a couple of years ago, he came out with, you know, aging artists sometimes don't age gracefully,
mhm,
but Dylan does. And I think part of his genius is he's 82 and he's trying to be 82.
mm,
He's not trying to be 22. He came out with this album, Rough and Rowdy Ways. It's really good. But then he released last year a kind of reworking of his earlier music. This is mostly music from the 60s, like, Blonde on Blonde, Highway 61 Revisited, things like that. It's called Shadow Kingdom, but done as the old man that he is. And the song, for example, Queen Jane, Approximately. If you listen to it off the 1966 Blonde on Blonde album, it's almost a taunt. He's talking to this woman and he says, all right, when you've had enough, you can come to me. And now he doesn't change any of the lyrics, but just the delivery it's when it's too much, you can come to me. And
mm.
it hasn't changed a single word,
Yeah.
but the delivery is now one. It's not the taunt of a young cocky 24-year-old. It's it's the gentle compassion of a man that's been through it all.
Mm,
And so I think those are worth exploring. But people then think I'm just kind of a folky. One of my favorite albums last year was Metallica's 72 Seasons. This is
mm,
Metallica. 72 seasons. This is a way of saying 18 years.
mm,
72. Oh, that's 18 years. And it's James Hetfield, frontman for Metallica, looking at just surviving those that that were for him and for many people can be those teen years.
yeah.
You know, from whenever coming into adolescence through about 18, it can be a rough ride. And he's looking back on that. And what's interesting is I think every single song I think it's good music. Now, if you don't like thrash metal, you're not going to like it. But lyrically, it's like,
Mm,
oh, I also see someone that, okay, approaching 60, maybe he is 60, I'm not quite sure, has a much more tender outlook on life. And
mhm,
the anger seems gone. And there's a song on there. I thought, well, I won't like this song. there was a song on it called "Screaming Suicide,"
Mm,
and I thought, well, this will be a terrible song. No, it's actually not. It's actually talking about it's a nice little sermon
mm,
saying, how to turn away from that voice and how
mm.
to eventually silence that voice that says, you should just end it. And it's actually, I find it remarkable that, they've survived and they actually, they're kind of like filling the role of someone like U2 right now. But
Yeah.
actually, it's a very positive album.
Mm,
And I think that's a beautiful thing to see as well. Plus,
great.
if you like to rock hard, you can rock hard.
You could rock hard with Metallica. You could be a little gentle and folksy
Yeah.
with Bob Dylan. So those are great recommendations. Thanks, Brian. If How could people connect with you? Go out and get your book, What Between the Worlds. What does that look like? Where would you
Well,
like
you
to
just
point people to?
here's what you do whatever you want, but my name is unusual as far as I know. I'm the only Brian Zahnd in the world, and so you can Google me, and you'll find that I'm fairly active on social media. We call it X now. Yeah, it's not the
All
same.
right. Yeah.
Instagram. Trying to do this Threads thing. I don't know if that's going to work or not. Facebook a little bit. I'm there. And you can find all my stuff on Amazon. If you Google me, you'll also find the cranks out there, doing their YouTubes telling you that I'm a heretic. But that's life on the rough and wild internet.
It is. That is life. But that's all right. So again, just as Metallica is telling you, silence those voices
Yeah.
of the dissenters. Follow Jesus. Follow the axis of love, the way of forgiveness, the wonderful, incredible, grotesque, shameful
Mm.
cross that brings us the love of God that reveals who God truly is. And if we follow that, we pick up our own cross, which is also grotesque. It's like picking up, as you said, the electric chair or the gallows and say, let's follow Jesus unto death as disciples of him. But thank you, Brian, for this conversation.
Thank you.
It was really, really good. And I really pray that a lot of people really see the different facets and aspects of the cross and that we continually get the meaning of what it looks like and that we could continually be confronted with what the cross truly is and we don't sanitize it just so we don't have to encounter it. So I just pray that Jesus encounters us all through this. So thank you, Brian.
Great. Thank you.